be about it in a big way, where he's going to do the anti-poverty, anti-imperialism. He starts to rightfully say that the chaos happening in the United States is produced by white racism, it's produced by white people and white supremacy, right? He says Congress is running, the halls of Congress are running wild with racism. He's saying white people, to the American Psychological Association in 1967, they're the ones producing the chaos, they're the ones producing the violence, and then they're making the claim that if there were no violence or chaos, there would be peace. Yet they're the ones who are producing the violence and the chaos.
Right.
So that's what you see from top to bottom, nationally. But the positives of the protests are that we now have an opportunity in that tradition of Malcolm and Martin to really transform this system.
You're tuned in to the Thinking Out Loud radio show, giving voice to issues that matter to you.
So my first question, Dr. Joseph, deals with was probably a question that you've heard of. As we said, you were telling me how you've been really busy here lately because of what's been happening around us. But I want to start here. Your book, The Sword and Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, is primarily written from a historical perspective related to both the lives of Dr. King and Malcolm X and how they intertwine. In light of the recent events taking place in our nation with the brutal murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Sean Reed, George Floyd, and countless others, Black men and women that fallen victim to this deadly virus of racism and police brutality, I want to know from you, what do you think Dr. King and Malcolm X's approach will be to handling these two deadly viruses of that we're dealing with today, racism and police brutality in America?
Yeah, no, Brother Michael, and I would add the COVID-19.
COVID-19, absolutely, yes.
And
those three.
Yeah, the virus of white supremacy. I think that, one, I wrote the book with contemporary audiences in mind and contemporary Black people and the struggles of Black Lives Matter, defeating white supremacy, eradicating racism, transforming the criminal justice system, decarcerating America, where we take all the Black men and women who are in prison and put them back in communities, because really most of them have been unjustly placed in prison when we look at it. And so I think about the way in which Malcolm struggled for radical Black dignity and Dr. King struggled for radical Black citizenship applied to the here and now. And so I think that they would be organizing massive protests. They would be organizing civil disobedience. I think they would be organizing in a lot of the fashion that we've seen. I think that obviously Dr. King was nonviolent, but as I show in the book, that doesn't mean he wasn't a revolutionary. Malcolm is the boldest critic of white supremacy until King takes up the mantle after Malcolm's assassination.
Right.
When we look at the book, you really see the way in which King pulls Malcolm's coat to voting rights and the idea that the grassroots might be able to change these democratic institutions. But Malcolm pulls King's coat to the depth and breadth of racism and white supremacy. This is a really exceedingly sick society. We see it with the murders of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. But the criminal justice system, Michael, is just the tip of the iceberg. And Malcolm knew this. King eventually gets to know it. Malcolm knew it because his father had been murdered by white supremacists in Lansing, Michigan in 1931. So Malcolm, like so many African Americans, so many Black people, I'll say, faces racial trauma at an early age. His mother, Louise Norton Little, is institutionalized at a psychiatric hospital. So many of us face mental illness and trauma because of white supremacist, anti-Black racist violence. So he's coming from that background. He's shuttled in foster homes for a few years, and then at 15, he goes and lives with his half-sister, Ella Mae Collins. And Ella, who becomes part of the Nation of Islam, she's a hustler in Boston. She's a hustler in Roxbury, right? And so he becomes part of that hustling life. And it's those structures of white supremacy that push you into hustling, because you can't find a vocation. You can't find a job. You can't get an education because of Jim Crow segregation and racial terror, right? And so Malcolm served 76 months in prison, 3 different facilities, and he joins the Nation of Islam, but we have to connect him joining the Nation of Islam with his father being a Garveyite. Marcus Mosiah Garvey is the head of the largest black mass mobilization in world history. 3 to 5 million people are part of the Universal Negro Improvement Association across several continents and the Caribbean. It's in the United States, in Africa, in Canada, in South America, in Latin America. That's what Garveyism is, and that's radical black political self-determination, both entrepreneurially, but also as a radical social movement. Black women are a big part of Garveyism, and Malcolm's politics are coming from that. The Nation of Islam is an offshoot of Garveyism. After Garvey is deported and eventually he dies, they never let him come back to Jamaica in 1940. But the movement continues, and so the Nation of Islam is actually an offshoot. Honorable Elijah Muhammad was a Garveyite, okay? And so when we think about the Nation of Islam, it is black nationalism, but it's black nationalism under the whole idea of a different rendition of the Islamic faith. Malcolm X was always a Muslim. Just because he was part of the Nation of Islam doesn't mean he was not a Muslim. So he doesn't just become a Muslim in 1964. You've got to respect people's religion. I grew up in New York City. Some people were 5%ers. Some people were Nation of Islam. Some people were Baptists, like me. Some people were Protestant Catholics. You can't say just because they are in a smaller sect that has its own interpretation of the religion, with Elijah Muhammad as the messenger, W.D. Farad as a living remnant of God himself. We can't say that they're not Muslim. So Malcolm X was always a Muslim starting in 1949, 1950. So he's a Muslim or Muslim for 16 years. And so when we think about Malcolm, Malcolm was in the belly of the beast as a prisoner. So he was organizing prison activism while a Muslim. So when we think about Malcolm X, he understood even before he's paroled from prison, August 7th, 1952, that the United States was this searing racial wilderness. He always says that. And when we think about what's going on today, Malcolm talked about black dignity connected to African liberation, connected to third world liberation. He was anti-colonial, but again, he was anti-white supremacy. So I say in the book that Malcolm X was Black America's prosecuting attorney because he charged white America with a series of crimes against black people dating back to racial slavery, okay? And so when we think about racial slavery, that sets up this racial caste system, this supply chain of grief, misery, premature death for black people, but a supply chain of wealth and privilege based on the super exploitation, the degradation of black lives for white people. And white people and black people are still enmeshed in that racial caste today, and everybody in between gets access to the worst part of the caste or the higher part of the caste based on their skin color and whether or not they can pass for white or they have to be relegated to black, right? So when we think about Malcolm X, I mean, Malcolm would be, a fierce critic of the racist criminal justice system. But the George Floyd protests are not just about the criminal justice system. They're about the criminal justice system as a gateway to panoramic systems of racial and economic oppression, injustice, war, violence, just criminality that's stemming from a long, long history. And once Dr. King really gets hip to that history, he had read about it, but it's really Watts and Harlem that makes him be about it in a big way, where he's going to do the anti-poverty, anti-imperialism. He starts to rightfully say that the chaos happening in the United States is produced by white racism, is produced by white people and white supremacy, right? He says Congress is running, the halls of Congress are running wild with racism. He's saying white people, to the American Psychological Association in 1967, they're the ones producing the chaos, they're the ones producing the violence, and then they're making the claim that if there were no violence or chaos, there would be peace. Yet they're the ones who are producing the violence and the chaos.
Right.
So that's what you see from top to bottom, nationally. But the positives of the protest are that we now have an opportunity in that tradition of Malcolm and Martin to really transform this system.